In May 2019, Huawei was added to a US trade restriction list and cut off from American technology overnight. Google pulled Android. TSMC stopped taking its orders. And it worked. Huawei's global smartphone share fell from a 20% peak to under 4%. Consumer revenue dropped almost 50% to $38 billion. In 2021, the company posted the first revenue decline in its history, down 28.5%. That's where most people stopped paying attention. Last year, Huawei made 880.9 billion yuan, roughly $128 billion, with net profit up 8.6%. It's printing 5 nanometer class chips without the machine the rest of the industry uses to print 5 nanometer chips. It builds its own memory now. Its own operating system has beaten iOS in its home market for 7 straight quarters, and this sits closer to your wallet than it looks. On July 1st, Huawei raised its prices and blamed memory shortages and AI chip demand. Xiaomi, OnePlus, and Lenovo did the same thing. The average smartphone now sells for $550, up $100 in a year. So how does a company cut off from every tool it needs and build the thing it isn't allowed to have? And what has it cost them to do it? Well, first you need to understand how total this was, because if you're picturing a fine or a tariff, none of what follows will land properly. May 2019 cut Huawei off from American software and components. Google was the visible part. No Play Store, no Gmail, no Maps. At home, where those apps aren't used anyway, that barely mattered. Everywhere else, it was fatal. Then, in September 2020, the actual door closed. Any factory on Earth using American equipment now needed a license to make chips for Huawei. That's every serious fab in existence. TSMC was gone. HiSilicon, Huawei's in-house chip design arm, had finished designs and nowhere on the planet to print them. So Huawei sold phones out of a cupboard. Kirin 9000S, it had rushed into production before the deadline, and Snapdragons, it was licensed to buy on the condition they couldn't do 5G. Sure, you could still buy a Huawei flagship in 2021, it just couldn't connect to a 5G network. The company sold on or off entirely to keep the brand alive. Global shipments fell to around 35 million units, from number 1 in the world to outside the top 5 for the first time since 2013. Consumer revenue landed at 243.4 billion yuan, down nearly half in 12 months. In Western Europe, sales collapsed by over 60% in a single quarter. In the UK, share went from 13% to under 3% inside a year. The restrictions did exactly what restrictions are supposed to do. Nobody serious disputes that. Then Huawei started doing something no company that size has ever had to do. So what do you actually do when nobody on Earth is allowed to sell to you? In February 2023, founder Ren Zhengfei gave a speech to a room of academics. Several universities, including Shanghai Jiao Tong, published the transcript afterwards. All of a sudden, we were sanctioned, and they could not provide us with the components and tools. My mind went blank, Ren said. Then he gave the numbers. Over 3 years, Huawei had replaced more than 13,000 components across its product range with domestic substitutes. It had redesigned over 4,000 circuit boards. 4,000. Every one of those boards is a shipping product that had to be pulled apart, re-laid out, retested, and recertified, because a part it was designed around no longer existed for them. Ren said board production had finally stabilized. It had taken 3 years to get back to stable. And the hardware was the easy half. Huawei ripped out its ERP system, also known as the software that runs ordering, inventory, and finance across the entire company, and replaced it with one it wrote itself. It moved on to its own operating system, its own database, its own compiler, and its own programming language. Research and development was $23.8 billion in 2022 alone. Last year, it hit 192.3 billion yuan, a company record. Then, in August 2023, with no launch event, no press release, and no announcement of any kind, Huawei quietly put the Mate 60 Pro on sale. Tech Insights bought one and took it apart. Inside was a Kirin 9000S, a 7nm processor built by SMYC in Shanghai on domestic silicon most of the industry had assumed didn't exist yet. But 7nm was still roughly inside what analysts thought was achievable. The part that was genuinely supposed to be impossible came later. So why was everyone so confident there was a hard ceiling? One machine, EUV lithography. ASML in the Netherlands is the only company on the planet that makes one, and it can't ship them to China. Without EUV, you're printing circuits using 193 nanometer light instead of 13.5 nanometer light, also known as you need several separate passes to draw a single layer. Each extra pass is another chance to misalign. Misalignment means dead chips. The consensus across the industry was flat and near universal. No EUV, no progress past 7 nanometers. Keep in mind what rides on that ceiling. If it holds, SMIC is permanently a generation and a half behind. Huawei's flagships stay stuck. In December 2025, Tech Insights confirmed SMIC had reached volume production on a node called N+3. That's 5 nanometer class. No EUV anywhere in the process. The chip they found it in was the Kirin 9030, sitting inside Huawei's current flagship. Then SemiAnalysis cut one open, put it under an electron microscope, and measured the finest wires inside it. Minimum metal pitch, 32.5 nanometers. That's tighter than Intel's brand new 18A node in Panther Lake, a company that can't buy the tool measured tighter than Intel using it. Granted, a phone chip was never the part of this that mattered most. So what did matter? AI. Huawei's Ascend line is the only real domestic alternative to NVIDIA inside China, and it's the reason any of this became a business rather than an engineering trophy. A phone processor doesn't train a frontier model. If Ascend flopped, the rebuild stayed a curiosity. The Ascend 910C went into mass production in early 2025. Around 800 teraflops of FP16 and 3.2 terabytes per second of memory bandwidth, roughly 80% of an NVIDIA H100. Alibaba, Baidu, and Tencent were reportedly among the first customers. Then in March this year, the Ascend 950 PR entered mass production. It's the first Huawei chip carrying Huawei's own high bandwidth memory, also known as the expensive stacked memory that sits beside an AI chip and feeds it data fast enough to keep it working. 128 gigabytes at one point, 6 terabytes a second, designed in-house. That's a market 3 companies used to own outright, and Huawei wasn't one of them. On April 24th, DeepSeek released V4, optimized specifically to run on Ascend. Huawei confirmed its entire Ascend supernode line supports it. Every major Chinese tech company started buying at once. Huawei's AI chip revenue was $7.5 billion last year. This year, it expects around $12 billion, based on orders already secured, according to the Financial Times. Reuters said it couldn't independently verify those figures. NVIDIA used to hold about 95% of that market. Jensen Huang, now says its share of AI accelerators there has effectively fallen to zero. He's also estimated the market would have been worth $50 billion this year. But before this turns into a highlight reel, look at what one of these chips costs to make. So how much? Nobody outside SMIC knows the exact figure. What we do know is the yield, and the yield tells you plenty. An April 2026 report from the American Enterprise Institute, written by Ryan Fedasiuk and Julia Torres, put SMIC's 5 nanometer yields at roughly 20%. Independent estimates for the 7 nanometer class process run from 46% down to 25%. So on the mature node, half the chips come out dead. On the new one, 4 and 5 do. Huawei pays for the wafer either way. It shows up in the accounts. Group revenue grew 2.2% last year, after 22% the year before. Cloud revenue from external customers fell 3.5% to 32.16 billion yuan. ICT infrastructure growth slowed to 2.6%. HiMA, Huawei's car alliance, delivered 45,046 vehicles in July, down 4.9% year-on-year and down for a second month running. And on July 1st, the company that beat the semiconductor ban put its own prices up because it couldn't absorb the cost of memory. Same story with the software. Harmony OS holds 19% at home, ahead of iOS for 7 quarters running, second only to Android. Outside China, it has no Google services, no WhatsApp, and roughly 4% share. Second biggest mobile OS in one country, and unusable in most of the others. None of this happened to Huawei. Ren made a call in 2019, and it was an expensive one. He bet that redesigning 13,000 components was cheaper than shrinking, and he spent $23.8 billion a year proving it. He got the chips. He also got 20% yields, a phone business that only really works in one country, and a company growing at 2% that used to grow at 22%. To be fair, that was the trade on the table. There wasn't a version of this where it came cheap. If you liked this video, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and click the next video on your screen to know how Huawei blows up the entire tech market with its latest announcement.